Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I feel sort of slightly loath to... what am I pressing here? That's the wrong one, isn't it? There we go. Slightly loath to dive in and sort of stop the conversation there, because Branko could clearly have gone on for much longer, and the questions are definitely the questions that are interesting ones to get into. And in case I forget later on, I've not put it in here, but what Branko was saying about endowments, do remind me at the end to tell me why I think I should give you all £10,000. I'm sure you won't forget that. It came out of our Intergenerational Commission, and it speaks directly to what Branko was just saying. So just a quick word on what the Resolution Foundation is, because I joined 10 years ago and I didn't really know what it was. So certainly when I was back doing my undergraduate degree, I had no idea about think tanks. We are a think tank. We are a charity, which means we have to be politically independent, so we can't be partisan in any way, but that does not mean we are neutral. So our charitable purpose is to support and improving outcomes for people on low and middle incomes. So that means everything we do, we look at through the lens of what does this mean for people at the bottom end of the income distribution. So we do lots of research, lots of economic research across the labour markets, taxes and benefits, housing, skills, lots of other things. And then we try and sort of shine a light on the problem, if you like, and make sure that politicians are aware of it. But also we try and come up with some solutions, including £10,000 to young people, which the government can choose to ignore us on, and often does, but occasionally they pick up some of the things we do, such as the national living wage, the higher minimum wage for people over the age of 25. That was one that we originally came up with. And even if they don't pay attention to what we're saying on the policy side, we do try and make sure that they do hear us on the problem statement side, so that we don't go away in that sense. So that's what we do. And it means that inequality is obviously something that's very close to our hearts and an important part of what we do. And inequality is certainly the right topic to be talking about, because in terms of the public's concern about inequality and poverty in the UK, it's at a 21-year high. So this is the Ipsos Mori Issues Index, which is a regular poll of the public, which sort of says, what are the things that are bothering you at the moment? Is it the NHS? Is it immigration? Is it this, that, and the other? And those dotted lines there are just showing you the sort of the monthly variation, which is quite bouncy. But the smooth line, the 12-month average, shows you that as of today, concern about inequality and poverty in the UK is at its highest in the entirety of this series, which goes back to the turn of the millennium. So the public care about inequality more so than ever before. And politicians care as well. Certainly some politicians do, and no surprise, I don't suppose, to see Jeremy Corbyn here. I could have given you any number of speeches that he's delivered over the last few years about inequality. Here he's talking about grotesque inequality, which he says almost flows naturally from the free market version of capitalism that we have in the UK, and says that the Labour Party pretty much exists in order to tackle this and to create social justice. So no great surprise there. Perhaps more of a surprise that some other politicians do actually talk about inequality more than we perhaps sometimes realise. So back when she first became Prime Minister, Theresa May's first speech on the steps of Downing Street, she chose to focus on what she called burning injustices about various forms of inequality that are prevalent in the UK, and said that she wanted her premiership to be defined and judged on the basis of whether or not she could tackle some of these inequalities. And the bad news for Theresa May is that 2.5 years on, she's not done a very good job of tackling lots of these inequalities. The good news for her is that's not the failure that she'll go down in the history books. So the politicians care and people care, and yet it's really hard, I think, to escape the fact that wherever we look, that too high inequality is still all too evident. So why aren't we making a difference? Why is it so hard? So I'm going to take you through a sort of couple of high-level thoughts on what the barriers are from a sort of policy perspective. One, because I'm an economist and I like problem statements as much as I like policy. One is very much focused on the fact that I think we misdiagnose the problem too often. We don't necessarily focus on the right things, or we draw the wrong conclusions from the data that's out there, or simply the data's not good enough. But then also, even when we do have a clear sense of what the problem is and maybe what some of the solutions might be, there is a problem of political will, as Branko's just touched on, I think, but also political room, particularly at the moment, I think, and that's important to reflect on as well. So, first of all, misdiagnosis, and in the first instance, let's talk about what the data tells us, but also the importance of lived experience and why sometimes the data isn't telling us everything we need to know. So this is a very simplistic characterization. I'm using a couple of newspaper headlines to make the point here. Some people, when they talk about UK inequality, simply say, well, we're just like the US. Might be a bit less drastic than it is in the States, but basically we're just like the US. And all of the same problems that the US have, and where they try and intervene and have policy solutions and they fail, well, it's going to be the same in the UK. And we might be a few years behind them, but there's not much we can do. Capitalism is broken. We need to fundamentally change capitalism, otherwise we'll always have this inequality. And I think you can draw that argument, you certainly can, and say that you need radical reform rather than tinkering, but we are not like the US. I've been doing this job for 10 years. When I first started, I thought we were like the US on inequality. And in many ways, in some ways we are, but in many ways we're not, and there are some important differences which we do need to draw out. Then there are those who take the data or interpret the data and say, do you know what? Inequality isn't rising anymore. This is yesterday's problem. It rose in the 1980s. It's not rising now. Actually, it's falling. So, let's carry on doing what we're doing. We're doing a pretty good job at the moment of not allowing inequality to rise in the UK. We might even be getting it down. So let's chill out a bit about that. I would say they are wrong as well. And as ever, the truth on all of this is just more complex than we'd like it to be. There's nuance. That means it's easy to distort. Different politicians tell different stories using basically the same data and get away with it because you can draw those conclusions if you choose your start and end dates in the right way. But also it means that there's merit and there's fruits in digging into this data and understanding it a bit better in order to work out where the interventions are most useful. So what's going on with the data? So this is, Branko's already introduced you to the Gini coefficient, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Basically, the closer this number is to 1, the more uneven the country is. This is income inequality. And what you can see for the UK is that pretty flat through the 60s, 70s, huge rise during the 1980s. And then since about 1990, we've had ups and downs. And so this is why different politicians can take different time periods and say it's rising, it's falling. Post financial crisis, for instance, it has been trending downwards, although we've got new data out today for the latest year, which shows that inequality has actually just popped back up again. But even with that increase today, the end point now where we're at is pretty much the same as we were at in 1990. So inequality hasn't changed a great deal in terms of that headline rate, which is weird because it's been flat for the best part of 20 years or so, and yet public's concern about inequality is higher than it's ever been before. Back in the 1999, when inequality was basically the same, people's concern was much lower. So what's going on? I think there's lots of different reasons, and it's important to dig into those reasons in order to work out what policy interventions you need. So reason number one, we just shouldn't forget it's high. So we've already seen some cross-country numbers. This just puts the UK in the international context and says, where does our Gini coefficient sit alongside other countries? And we're at the wrong end of this particular international league table. This is after taxes and benefits. If we switch to the version that is before taxes and benefits, then all the numbers are bigger here. UK's ranking doesn't change, but interestingly, we're now above the US. So I've said we're not like the US, actually we're worse than the US on the market income side of things, which means our tax and benefit system is working harder than the US one is at actually redistributing and changing the dial on this. But nevertheless, I think if you think about lived experience, the fact that we have such high levels of inequality, people sort of compare themselves to their peers in terms of their earned income, their labour income, and so on and so forth. So I think this is an important number as well. So it's high, and we shouldn't forget that. So those who say, but hang on, it's flat, or indeed it's falling, chill out, no, because we've not fixed the problem that was created during the 1980s. Reason number two, and this is where you really start to get into the lived experience of inequality, is that actually, if you measure incomes after accounting for people's housing costs, it is still rising. So within the survey data that we collect, that the government collects across 20,000 households every year, each household is asked, how much are you spending on your housing? Whether that's a mortgage, whether that's rent, or whatever. And in the headline measure, so the dark line that I showed originally, we don't think about that housing costs. We just put the housing numbers into the deflator. So we, across the population as a whole, we account for rising housing costs, but we don't specifically allocate it to the people who are actually feeling it. But you can. you can take an after housing cost measure of income. And if you do that, you get the red line here. And what you see is that inequality is both higher and is continuing to rise. Not as starkly as it did in the 1980s, but continuing to rise nonetheless, which tells you, again, lived experience, what really matters. I can't escape my housing costs. So what really matters on the inequality side, it looks like inequality is still rising. So maybe that's why people feel like it's more of an issue now than it was before. And then there's the sort of breaking down into different groups. So the chart here is just showing you indexed median income, or average income rather, within certain groups. So the green line is pensioner households, and then the other two lines are working age households. For, the pink one being higher income working age households, and the darker one being low to middle income working age households. And what you can see is that incomes grew at pretty much the same pace in all three of those groups between the mid-90s and about 2003. And then from 2003, so before the financial crisis hit, we had this stagnation of income growth for the working age households. Those on low to middle incomes did less well than those on higher incomes, but the pensioner group continued to rise. And the pensioner group continued to rise even once we hit the financial crisis. All right, a small pause, but continued to rise. And partly that's triple lock, partly it's richer pensioners starting to retire, and so there's a compositional effect within the group. And partly it's they're not affected by labour market issues that were affecting other groups over this period. But what it means is that if you think about the overall inequality figure that I've shown you so far, that includes pensioners, and pensioners used to be poor. And there are still lots of poor pensioners, but pensioners as a group are less poor than they used to be. And so the overall inequality figure might be being dragged down by the fact that pensioners are doing better, and therefore some poor people are doing better than they used to do. But if you are working age and poor, then things don't look so good. So again, the lived experience, if you're working age and poor, may feel very different to what the statistics tell you. And then I think the most important reason why inequality concern is so high now is this, that existing high inequality just matters more when the pie isn't growing as quickly as it used to. So the chart here is just showing you the cumulative growth in GDP per capita across different economic cycles. So every time we hit a recession, I reset it to 0. And what you can see is on the far right-hand side there, we have that period since the financial crisis, and you get a downturn in GDP per capita, which is sharper than anything we'd seen since the Second World War, and then the recovery is pretty paltry. So if the pie isn't growing, and we've already got high inequality, then to some extent the chickens come home to roost, and that's why people start to feel more disillusioned. And it's not just about those at the very bottom saying, hang on, I haven't got as much as someone else. It's about society as a whole saying, hang on, my life isn't turning out the way I thought it was going to. It's not developing in the way that my parents' life developed for them. So there's something wrong here. And when you start to look around and start to scratch, then you do start to unpick some of these problems around inequality. So let's bring all of that together. Let's talk about working age households rather than pensioners. Let's talk about after housing costs income. And let's think about not just inequality, but also growth in income, the actual growth that people are experiencing. So just pause and explain what this chart is showing you. This is a growth incidence curve. So it is saying, first of all here, 1977 to 1991, the average annual growth in people's after housing costs income over that period, split by where they are in the working age income distribution. So the poorest households on the left, the richest households on the right. So what you've got is that if you were rich in this period, if you were towards the top end of the income distribution, then on average, every year your income was going up by about 5%. If you were in the middle, on average, it was going up by about 3% every year, and down towards the bottom, going up by about 1%, and at the very bottom, not going up at all. So this is the 1980s. This is the classic period of inequality. Top moving away from middle, middle moving away from bottom. Society getting more stretched overall. Growth for most people, but very, very much quicker at the top than elsewhere in the distribution. So I call that the strong but skewed 1980s. You then move into, I think, what you can call strong and shared 1990s. Very different. Now, all of a sudden, you've got income growth of about 3% on average everywhere in the income distribution. And what's going on here is you've got an increase in employment, which is supporting incomes at the bottom end of the income distribution, where you had more unemployed people to start off with. You've also got, towards the end of this period, the introduction of the minimum wage, which is supporting market incomes for lower paid people. And you've got the development of tax credits and other forms of state support, which supported families with children, and supported those in work but struggling to get by. So all of these things coming together meant that we had this sort of strong and shared period of growth between 91 to 2002. And then, as we've already seen, from about 2002 for working age households, income growth really slowed down, stagnated for many. So this is pre-crisis, so this is not about the financial crisis. There's something else going on here. And what we've got is this rise in inequality again, top moving away from the middle, middle moving away from the bottom, but more generally a slowdown in overall growth. So everybody, compared to the 1980s, wherever they are in the income distribution, things aren't quite as good as they were in terms of the growth rate just a couple of decades earlier. But it's still worse to be at the bottom than it is to be in the middle, and worse to be in the middle than it is to be at the top. And what's going on here is that employment growth that we had in the 90s slows and in fact goes into reverse. Benefits are no longer keeping pace with earnings, and housing. Housing is the big issue here. And I say the UK is not the US. Housing is one of those areas where the UK just does look different from a lot of other countries because of its housing problem. And so what's going on here is not just that housing costs are rising, but that the lack of access to home ownership for people on low and middle incomes compared to what went before means that more of them are renting, and renting costs you more on an ongoing basis than a mortgage does, by and large. So there's the housing headwind that's blowing in this period is blowing harder at the bottom of the distribution than it is elsewhere. And if I did this on a before housing cost basis, that line would be flat rather than sloped as it is. And then finally into the post-crisis period, where, to coin a phrase, we really were all in it together, because basically in this period, growth just stops. And you can take different points in this period. The immediate post-crisis period, those at the top suffered the most because they had very high incomes, many of them in the financial market and so on and so forth, and those are the incomes that were hit. More recently, towards the bottom end, it is those who are in receipt of state support who have had that support cut, and so there's been stagnation there. So different things going on, but overall, what we've basically got is a period of almost complete standstill on income growth and no real change in inequality, but boy does it hurt more when there's no growth. And so there's an open question there. Where would you rather be? Would you rather be in the 1980s when inequality is rampaging? But if you look at that 1977 to 91 curve, at every single point of the income distribution, it is higher than where we've been in the last decade. And of course, the truth is you don't want to be in either of those. You want to be probably in the 1990s, that strong and shared period of growth, which didn't happen by accident. You had to have policies in place which made it happen. So lots to take away from that. My main conclusion is that we need to focus on the lived experience of inequality and its interaction with wider economic growth. It's not just about inequality itself. So that was only one of the misdiagnoses. What about the inequalities we don't talk enough about? And I'll rattle through these because I just want to use these as illustration rather than dig into them in lots of detail. But this chart is just showing you the pay gaps that exist between different groups and white men in the UK. So Indian men, white women, Pakistani, Bangladeshi men and black men compared to white men, split between whether they're non-graduates and graduates, so you're closer to comparing apples with apples. And what you see is that for all of these groups, there is a significant pay gap. And we can do the same for women and you get bigger gaps again. I'm just selecting a few here for clarity. So you might care about that in and of itself and say, well, can we try and fix that, please? But you might also say, well, okay, these are different groups. Pakistani, Bangladeshi men might on average be younger than white men, and therefore that might be one reason why they are earning less. White women might be more likely to work part-time than white men, so maybe that's one of the reasons why they're earning less. So obviously, the way to get at that is to control everything, do a regression analysis. I won't get into the details, but we do the regression analysis. We control for what part of the country people are in, how old they are, what actual level of qualification they've got, whether it's a first or a 2-2, and so on and so forth. What industry they're in, what occupation they're in, whether they're working full-time, part-time. The pay penalty still exists. The red dot still exists. So there's something else here. There's something structural which, when we throw in the kitchen sink at it, we cannot explain that there is still a pay gap for certain groups. And we don't talk about this enough, partly because we don't have good enough data on this and partly because it's quite hard to do more than say you're not allowed to discriminate against people. But the truth is, getting equality is about more than just making everything the same for everybody. You actually need to go further in many instances and deal with some of the structural problems which exist. So that's just an example of some of the inequality we don't talk about enough. And it's not just race, this is just showing employment rates across different parts of the country. So each dot here on each line is a different region or country within the UK. So at the top there, you've got for all working age people, what is the employment rate across the country. You see there's a bit of a spread, which tells you straight away there's a bit of a regional divide here in the UK, which we're obviously aware of. Next, you've got the high performing group, which is basically white men, highly educated, no health difficulties, where their employment rate is pretty much 95%, pretty much everywhere in the country. And it doesn't really change even in recessions. That high performing group is always has very high levels of employment. But then you look at women, ethnic minorities, people with low qualifications and people with disabilities, you get lower employment rates and a much bigger spread across the country, which again tells you it's harder getting into work if you've got a disability in some parts of the country than it is in others. There might be an overall disability employment gap, which we may or may not be able to do something about, but the fact that we have regional gaps should tell you that there's definitely something going on there that we need to focus on a bit more. And then I won't say much about this other than that intersectionality of disadvantage is more than just the sum of two things. So if you are disabled and Bangladeshi, then your disadvantage is not the same as the disadvantages that someone who's disabled has plus the disadvantages that someone who's Bangladeshi has. It is compounded and it's bigger and it's different. And we don't, again, talk enough about that sort of inequality. And then wealth. Branko's obviously already touched a lot on capital income. I'm focusing here on wealth in terms of size of assets. And the main thing to say is, A, it's a big deal. There's a lot of it about £11 trillion in 2012 to 14 wave of the Wealth and Assets Survey across British households, split between private pensions, net property, net financial wealth, and then physical wealth. These are the, the paintings, the cars, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot about, and we've not talked enough about it in the UK, certainly, mainly because we've not had very good data on it until quite recently. And now we do have some data and we can start looking at it. But in the political world, it's just something that doesn't sort of resonate enough, I don't think. Particularly, as Branko's already shown, because the Gini coefficient on wealth, on different types of wealth, but on wealth overall, is that much higher than it is for income. Now, you'd expect the Gini on wealth to be higher because you accumulate wealth as you age, and then you should, in theory, decumulate it at some point in your life as well. But nevertheless, clearly it's high, and therefore we should be talking more about it than we do, particularly because it does compound income inequality, as we'll get onto in a second. So then the last one of these other areas of inequality that we don't talk about enough, which you'd expect me to talk about given we've just done a 2-year commission on intergenerational equity, is intergenerational equity. So as a way into this, let's just look at this chart in the first instance. So this is showing you for the cohort born in 1951 to 55, what is the median earnings of that cohort at every age. So that cohort today is in its 60s, and the median pay is about £400 a week. But when that cohort was in its 50s, the median pay was about £500. When it was in its 20s, it was about £300. So this is a classic life cycle, life stage earnings curve that you'd expect to see. You earn more as you age, it peaks around about age 50, and then it tails off as you head towards retirement. So that's the 51 to 55 cohort. The next cohort that came along, 56 to 60, did better at every age. Same shape, but better at every age, other than as they enter their sort of mid to late 50s, because that's the financial crisis. The financial crisis knocks everyone's earnings, but at least they've had a whole lifetime of earning more than the cohort that came before them, and therefore should have been able to build some assets, etc., etc. And that's the standard picture as you work through the 20th century. Each cohort does better than the one that came before it until we hit the financial crisis. And if you ask the public, as we did, should we expect this? The public says yes. This is part of what I expect capitalism to give me, is that my children will do better than I do. Unfortunately, this is the bad news for you guys. Once we start to get into the millennial group, things grind to a bit of a halt. Now, this is obviously the financial crisis effect, so this is just, this is bad luck. But the problem is, it could then have a scarring effect. So those born 1981 to 85, entering the labour market, actually did no better than those who came before them, and then when the financial crisis hit, went onto a lower trajectory. And the question now is, can they regain where they would have been otherwise, or are they now destined to forevermore be on a lower trajectory? And actually, for the younger millennial group, their earnings are have gone back 15 years effectively. Who knows what comes next? My advice is stay in university. So there's something going on there intergenerationally, and there's lots of other versions of this that I can show you that cover different topics. But the one I did want to get into is wrapping this back into wealth. And in particular, so in the first instance, just housing, because this is the one that middle-class parents like to talk about, which is the extent to which we've gone backwards in terms of rates of home ownership across the generations. So you can see here a similar deal where this time I've just got generations rather than cohorts, and I'm showing you the proportion of people at every age who own their own property. And you move up from the lost generation, forgotten generation, greatest generation, silent generation into the baby boomers, and each generation doing better than the last in terms of levels of home ownership. So you've got baby boomers now entering retirement, 3/4 of them own their own homes. That then goes into reverse for Generation X, and even more so again for millennials, so that at age 30, those millennials who've got there are half as likely to own a house as the baby boomers were. Now, you can say, well, hang on, we shouldn't get so hung up on housing. Lots of people on the continent don't talk about home ownership all the time. Why are we so obsessed about it? And I have a lot of sympathy with that. But first and foremost, you try telling people to stop caring about home ownership, and they don't want to. People want to own their own home for cultural reasons, yes, but it's very hard to change people's mind on that. But also, importantly, on the housing cost side, we've talked before about the housing headwind and the fact that housing costs are a big factor in what's driving inequality in the UK. Well, for those people who are stuck in the private rented sector longer term with its higher ongoing costs than having a mortgage, then that's going to be a factor in driving inequality going forward. And it's harder, obviously, to build assets in a world in which you're not building an asset simply by living in one. And in actual fact, if we look at the median net wealth per adult for each different cohort and the extent to which it is higher than the cohort that came before it. So each bar here is showing you from the 1926-30 cohort on the right-hand side, moving through to the youngest cohort on the left. Each bar is then saying, in 2012-14, at the age that cohort is at now, or at that time, did it have more wealth than the cohort that came before it? And if so, how much? And what you get is those positive bars through to the cohorts of the 60s saying, yes, each cohort that came along had more wealth at its particular age in 2012-14 than the cohort that preceded it. But for those born since about the mid-60s, that has stopped. So actually, when we talk about this sort of wealth effect, it's something that's been going on for quite a while. It's not just a millennial issue in this instance. And you obviously get pushback from people who've bought property, and many people in older cohorts who've bought property have lived through times of double-digit interest rates and negative equity and had all sorts of issues to contend with, and I certainly don't want to belittle that in any way whatsoever. And they say, you just have to make the sacrifices, and we didn't go out eating all the time like kids today do. We didn't go around the world, et cetera, et cetera. They are now, by the way, because they're rich baby boomers. But back then we didn't. And we just have to make the sacrifices. That is all true. But what this chart is showing you is, for each cohort, the purple diamonds are showing you how much the net wealth increased for that cohort over the 20-year period between 93 and 2012-14. And what you've got in most instances is the purple, this is property wealth, by the way. The purple diamonds are quite big. So overall, something like 70,000 increase in property wealth for across all these cohorts. What looks like blue on this screen, I think it should be green, but bars are showing you how much of that is active savings. This is people actually going out and saying, right, I'm buying a bigger house, therefore I'm sort of investing in the property market, or I'm paying down my mortgage, or I'm making a home improvement, I'm building an extension, so on and so forth. So I'm actively increasing this asset, increasing the value of this asset. And as you can see, it doesn't make up very much of the total gains that people get. So the residual, the yellow and the gold bit, is actually what you would say is just kind of like, look, this is just house price effect, effectively. And we can be fair and say, well, okay, the gold bit is what you would expect if you put your money into a different type of investment, because there's an opportunity cost to putting money into property. But the yellow bit is still the look bit. So there's an awful lot of good fortune about the wealth that has been built up by a certain generation, certain cohorts, which I think it's hard to imagine being repeated. So even if we were to get to a situation where we were able to increase the amount of home ownership among younger generations, it's unlikely, I think, that we would see this sort of house price effect again. So the wealth that's sitting there within this generation, the reason I'm sort of talking about this and spending a bit of time on it, is that this might be a sort of one-off thing, except of course it's not one-off, because the good news for all you is that at some point these guys will die, and then all this will be yours. So what the chart here is showing you is the prevalence or the probability of inheritances for different cohorts, split by where people sit within the income distribution within those cohorts. So the bottom line is the 1930s cohort, and this is in the period 2006 to 2013, so we average across the period. So the poorest fifth of households within the 1930s cohort had about 25% chance of getting some sort of inheritance at some point, and the richest fifth had just over 50% chance. And then with each cohort that comes along, the probability has been rising, such that for the 1970s cohort, even the poorest fifth within the 70s cohort has a higher probability of getting an inheritance than the richest fifth in the 1930s cohort. So inheritances are becoming a bigger deal. And so all this wealth will trickle down at some point. So maybe we shouldn't worry too much. Except, of course, there are, I think, three problems with this. One, it embeds inequality. So focus here just on the darker line, which is showing you for 20 to 35-year-olds in 2015-16, split again by the poorest fifth on the left, the richest fifth on the right. What's the average level of parental property wealth that these young people have? And you can see it's much higher. So if you are, as you move up the income distribution, so if you are a higher income young person, then you are the pink line is showing you more likely to have a parent with property wealth, but also the dark line showing you that the level of that wealth is much higher. So as this wealth cascades down the generations, it will embed and reinforce existing inequality, and that's why I think we should worry about it. Secondly, as Branko's already pointed out, money attracts money. So the x-axis here is showing you, for couples under the age of 50, what inheritance people are expecting to get. So the x-axis is showing the first person in the couple, so from zero inheritance on the left to £500,000 inheritance on the right. And then the height of the bars is showing you what their partner is expecting to get separately. And so for someone who's not expecting any inheritance, on average, their partner says they're expecting £25,000 worth of inheritance. And for someone who's expecting £500,000 worth of inheritance, on average, their partner is expecting £190,000 worth of inheritance. So the compounding element here of embedding this inequality across the generations is quite astounding. And then finally, this is the really fun chart. This is how you work out when your parents are going to die. And the bad news is not soon enough. So this is just saying for adults aged 20 to 35, what age have their parents either already died or would be expected to die? And all it shows you is that the peak is around age 60. So if you want this wealth in order to be able to support your children or to buy a property or to do any of the things that you might want to do, be an entrepreneur and so on and so forth, then you're not really going to get it until you are retired. So obviously some families choose to make gifts while they're still alive, but that requires you to be able to liquidate your assets, and richer people are better at that than less rich people. So for lots of reasons, this wealth issue is one that we need to talk about more and understand more and do more about. So my main conclusion from all that is that a narrow focus on income inequality risks missing some structural barriers. Right, finally, misdiagnosis number 3, not just economics, stupid. This word cloud is something that Britain Thinks put together very shortly after the referendum, and this was a focus group they brought together, and the researchers themselves said they were shocked at how quickly the room polarised, how quickly people sort of divided themselves into camps and were quite abusive about some of the people in the room. Lots of words came out, obviously, but the main word that came out of that session was divided. There was a sense that there was this real divide within the UK. Now, obviously, economics is a part of this, and people talked about being haves and have-nots. But lots of the words here, I think, speak to something else. Like, overcrowded, fractured. What have I just unreeled there? Multicultural, or it's not clear whether that was a positive word or a negative word. And ultimately, I think, just confused. Now, this is immediately after the referendum. There was, tensions were high, but there's a lot going on. And I think since the referendum, we've not really put that genie back in the bottle on all of this. And some of it is about economics, some of it is not. So looking at the referendum itself, certainly it seems like economics matters. So this is just showing that each dot is a local authority in Great Britain and shows you across the y-axis there, the proportion who voted to leave, and the x-axis is the median hourly pay within that local authority. So it looks like the better the pay, the less likely you were to vote leave. Except that, there's lots of exceptions to the rule. Yes, bottom right, you've got high pay, low leave areas, and top left, you've got low pay, high leave areas, but you've also got this top right, higher paying, relatively high leave areas, and bottom left, lower paying, relatively low leave areas. So there's lots going on here, and again, the way to dig into this is to do some regression analysis, and I'm not going to go through the numbers, but instead I'll just use fancy arrows. So economics does matter, and what we showed when we controlled for everything else is that the employment rate was the thing which stood out as being a significant driver of the leave vote. So the higher the employment rate, the lower the leave vote. Median pay didn't have a significant effect in this instance, but that's partly because of correlation between pay and employment, and so I wouldn't read too much into it. Basically what we can say is economics mattered. But it's the old inequalities that really seem to matter. So when we looked at change in median pay over the decade and change in the manufacturing mix within these local authorities over a longer period, they didn't have any effect. And it seems to suggest that to the extent that economics is mattering, it's about the change that we saw through the 80s and that has been fixed more or less since then, rather than any change that we've seen over the last 10, 15 years or so. But nevertheless, economics mattered. But it wasn't the only thing. So too did demographics. So areas with high numbers of students, less likely to vote leave. In this instance, ratio of old to young didn't bite, but that's partly, I think, because we're looking at local authorities rather than individuals. And we've repeated it for individuals, and you do see an old and young split. But then on immigration, I think it's interesting because we can obviously dismiss some people who voted for Brexit and say, well, xenophobic, racist, et cetera, et cetera. Actually, if you look at local authorities in terms of the share of non-UK born population, it is not a significant factor in the Brexit vote. So areas with high numbers of migrants, every bit as likely to vote leave or remain as areas with low numbers of migrants. But what did matter was the pace of change over the previous decade. So what you might be looking at there is one of two things. One, people sort of saying, from all the stuff I showed you before, this has been a crap decade. What's changed? And looking around, you can see that something's changed, so maybe there is a bit of blame throwing. But equally, it could be actually lots of people coming into the area, putting pressure on schools, on doctors, on housing, etc. So that there is a genuine issue there, which could have been fixed because the people coming in also bring tax revenues, and they could have used those tax revenues to build more houses, etc. But nevertheless, maybe there's a genuine thing there. But anyway, the basic point is demographics matters as well as economics. And so too does culture. There's a question that used to get asked, which doesn't get asked anymore, which is about, do people in your area get on with people who aren't like them? And the less likely you were to say yes, the more likely you were to vote leave. That is the racist question. Home ownership, I can't explain, but areas with higher home ownership, more likely to vote leave. Could just be something else going on in the model that can't quite pick out, but nevertheless it tells you there's something that's not about economics necessarily, because we're controlling for income, we're controlling for age, we're controlling for all those other things, but also some regional specifics. So Scotland, each local authority in Scotland more likely to vote Remain than any other local authority once you control for everything else, and West Midlands the opposite. So Scotland, you might say, well, that's the SNP, that's political leadership, that's people saying I'd rather be ruled by Brussels than by Westminster. You can understand all that. West Midlands, less clear. So there's cultural stuff going on as well. And actually the thing that the strongest explanatory factor is education level. So local authorities with high numbers of degree holders, much less likely to vote leave. And for me, that straddles economics, demographics and culture. So this is all just a way of saying that social class, economics, it's changing. The boundaries are changing. What we think about politics and how we approach inequality is changing. And you can see it in the way that people vote now. So on the left there you've got people's voting in 1974 general election by social class. So that's top social class of ABC1 used to be 3 times as likely to vote Conservative as vote Labour. And equally, the bottom social class of DE, 3 times as likely to vote Labour as vote Conservative in 1974. 2017 election, virtually no difference whatsoever. So those old social class boundaries seem to have broken down and instead replaced to some extent by age. So the dotted line here showing you the 1974 vote shares by age and the solid lines, the 2017. And you can see that now you've got a sort of 3-to-1 ratio among young people, Labour to Conservative, and a 2-to-1 ratio for older people, Conservative to Labour. So we've become more polarised in our political views by age than used to be the case. So what do we take away from all of that? I think primarily that it's just harder to get buy-in to political messages along the old party lines. So just sort of appealing to a certain group and saying, you know, this is inequalities about them and us. Well, them and us is changing, and what we mean by that is changing. So lots of misdiagnosis. What do we take away from all that? I think that we really need to understand and be honest about what's really going on with inequality, rather than just waving a placard and saying, what someone think of the children. We actually have to get under the skin of it and work out what's going on. And that allows us then to start to focus on the things that matter, which increasingly might be about things like wealth as well as about income inequality, for instance. But let's say we've nailed the problem statement. What about the solution? I say there's a lack of political will, which again reflects, I think, much of what Branko's just said in terms of political capture, but also, I think, political room, particularly at the moment, given the messy state of politics in the UK. So in theory, this is the public saying that the blue line there, what proportion are in favour of increasing taxes and spending more? It was falling for quite a period through the 2000s, and then at some point I think austerity fatigue kicks in and it's been picking up ever since. The red line tells you that no one ever says that they want to reduce taxes and spend less and have a smaller state. You don't necessarily believe them, but very few people actually say it. But I think take as a proxy instead the proportion who say let's just keep things as they are, we like the status quo, thanks very much. So we've seen a crossover in those two lines. So in theory, the public's well up for it. It cares about inequality and it thinks we should be taxing more and spending a bit more. But one of the problems is we're sort of running harder now to stand still. So this chart is just showing you what proportion of GDP we spend on some of the big things that we do, health and care, social security and education. And the projection there is just showing you what's going to happen with demographics. So just the ageing population means that we need to spend more on health and care just to stand still, just to provide the same level of provision for tomorrow's older people as we've provided for those of today. So yes, we can increase taxes, but if we do, it's going to get swallowed up by this stuff really quickly. So doing anything to fundamentally change some of the other things that we care about, we need even more taxes. So we're sort of running uphill to some extent. And we can't do what we used to do, which is just say, let's get rid of all the guns and let's buy more nurses, because we don't really spend very much on military anymore anyway. So that sort of lower hanging fruit is kind of disappearing. And then politics gets in the way as well. So just give you a quick case study on social care. Many of you, I'm sure, will have some interaction with social care and know that it's an area that is underfunded, overstretched, and the provision very much depends on your resources. And if you don't have the resources, then unfortunately you often don't get very good care. And it's been a problem for a long time. So back in 2009, Labour put together a green paper where they said, let's have compulsory insurance. So they say, let's spread the risk across everybody. Makes sense. And to do so, in order to sort of raise some extra revenue, you don't have to pay us right now, you can pay us out of your estate. So tapping into some of that wealth, some of that baby boomer wealth in particular. It's a pretty sensible approach. But inevitably, politics being politics, it was immediately chastised as being the death tax, a label which stuck, and ultimately Labour dropped that particular policy, ran away from it. 2017, by then we'd had lots of other goes at trying to fix the social care system. There'd been commissions and all sorts of things, all recommending some variation of what Labour had been saying anyway, but no one really wanted to go there. So by 2017, the Conservative Manifesto, Conservatives came up with something which was in many ways even more radical, where they said, For domiciliary care, so this is care where you don't actually go into a residential home, you just stay in your own home, we're going to start means testing people for support with that as well, which at the moment is not means tested. Or it is rather, but it's only on income. But we're going to bring your property wealth in as well. So again, let's try and tap into some of that property wealth. So if you have property wealth, then we want you to use it to pay for your own care in your own home, which again, kind of makes sense because otherwise the alternative is you don't get any care. But again, you'd have to pay for it until you die. Pay for it out of your estate, so you'll never miss it. What happened? Well, you reap what you sow. So the Lib Dems immediately jumped on this and said, well, this is dementia tax. This is no better than the death tax that came before. And so we then had, and even the Tories' own supporters jumped on this. And so we then had the clarification, Theresa May's famous speech in which she said that nothing has changed, and she basically rode back from the policy as it stood. And she's right, nothing has changed. We're now in 2019, and the social care system is still broken. And that is down to people playing politics. Then there are pledges, which can prove constraining. So this is the Chancellor back in the budget 2017, introducing a new tax rise, modest tax rise for self-employed people. It was a package, and it was progressive overall. So for the majority of self-employed people who are lower earning, they actually did better out of it, because it got rid of a regressive cash element, but it increased the proportional element, which meant that higher earning self-employed people would pay more tax. So it equalised things a bit between employees and self-employed people, meant there was less arbitrage going on, less incentive for people to call themselves self-employed in order just to gain on the tax side. And it was progressive overall. But again, attacked from his own side, the Sun playing on white van man, saying that this was terrible, but crucially saying that it broke the election pledge, which The Guardian also says there. And here is that pledge from the 2015 manifesto, rather, which Philip Hammond did not write. Instead, this was Cameron and Osborne, who were no longer around by the time of the budget 17, but they said commit to no increases in VAT, national insurance contributions or income tax. And so this pledge, which was in the manifesto, which was designed to win votes, because hey, vote for us and we're not going to increase your taxes, came back to bite them because this very sensible policy, which Philip Hammond then wanted to introduce, he had to drop. But there's something else in that pledge as well, which is this promise to increase the point at which people pay income tax personal allowance to £12,500 and the higher rate to £50,000. This was a continuation of a policy that the coalition government had introduced, which is basically an income tax cut. And that's just really expensive. And it was a pledge which they knew played well with voters, was really popular. They sold it as being a low earner tax cut, because the thing was, we're going to take you out of tax, you don't have to pay tax anymore. You can only do that once. Once you've taken someone out of tax, then every further income tax cut you give, they don't benefit from. So you can see the blue bars there together are this high rate threshold and personal tax allowance pledge, costing something like £20 billion. 3/4 of that goes to households in the top half of the income distribution. So that's a really expensive pledge, and it's something which is redistributing to those who are already doing okay. A couple of other big tax cuts there as well around corporation tax and fuel duty, which have added up. So you've got something like £40 billion worth of tax cuts going on in a period of austerity, a period in which we were cutting lots of things because we had to, because we were all in this together, and yet we somehow found the room for these tax cuts because tax cuts are very popular. But what is easy to do if you're in government is to cut people's benefits. And so the pledge before the 2015 election was that, from the Conservatives, was that they would cut 12 billion out of working age benefits. They probably didn't expect to be voted in 2015. They thought there would be another coalition with the Lib Dems and that the Lib Dems would tell them not to be so horrible and that they could not deliver what they were promising. But the promise sounded good, it sounded tough, it sounded like the sort of thing that you would do if you were fiscally responsible. And unfortunately, they were voted in from the perspective of this because it meant that they then had to deliver it. So what we've had overall since 2015, if you add up all of the tax and benefit policies that have been introduced in that period, is a massive redistribution from those in the bottom half of the income distribution to those at the top. I won't do that. And of course, the other thing that gets in the way at the moment is that everyone's a bit distracted. There's a lot going on in politics, and it's really hard to do anything when you haven't got a working majority. So, problem of political will, need to focus on the positive case for tackling inequality and one that benefits all parts of society. So sell it. Sell the message. It's not just about waving the old red flag if you're Labour and saying rally round us. you have to start selling the message about why you want greater equality. And finally, I'm sort of running out of time, but I just want to do some areas for hope, because I don't want to be too gloomy. Areas for hope. We've done stuff. We have been successful. Minimum wages, both the introduction of the minimum wage in the first place and the national living wage, hugely successful. No negative employment effect, supporting millions of people taking them out of low pay. Active labour market policies, we've had a really progressive period for employment growth. Employment now at a record high. You can question the quality of some of those jobs, and absolutely, but it has been progressive. The people who've been most likely to move into work are those in lower income households, and they are better off for it in the main. In-work tax credits and childcare support, this development of those in the 1990s is what led to that strong and shared period of income growth, and also massively increased the employment rates of single parents in particular, because it made it worth their while. And the child poverty targets, which I've just skipped over, but actually having targets in place, focused the mind and meant that we brought child poverty down, but actually we did a much better job than we thought. The policy was more effective than the data suggested, because the data was fundamentally wrong, and if we adjust the data, we did a much better job than we thought, and we did hit those targets. And we've now allowed those targets to lapse, and inequality and poverty is going in the opposite direction. This wealth issue, there's a lot of it. So the blue line is just showing you total wealth as a share of GDP, which we know is massively increased over a period. The pink line is the wealth taxes as a share of GDP, where actually that's been flat. So we have got an opportunity here to tap into that. And we don't have to rely just on Westminster anymore. We have the Metro mayors down there, who are a nice, diverse, white male bunch. We have Scotland, which is doing interesting things, different approach to income tax, has an inclusive growth strategy. And we have grassroots organisations, living wage, and so on. So it doesn't have to just be Westminster. And technology doesn't have to be the enemy. We can use technology to support worker empowerment as well. And there's some interesting new things happening there. And ultimately, Britain's very good at some point saying enough's enough. And taking Branko's point about political capture, actually you're now getting middle class people, wealthier people saying we can't go on like this. So there is a moment right now, I think, where we can appeal to people's better nature, as it were, particularly as things are about to get worse, which is what that chart shows you. So, conclusion, misdiagnosis is unhelpful, can make us complacent. We can just say everything's okay, or just as wrongly fatalistic, we can say there's nothing we can do, it's all broken, we might as well have a revolution. But it also makes it harder to pick the right interventions. Today's messy politics isn't helpful. You can't fix that overnight, but big majorities help, so maybe having some sort of stable politics is useful. But also just have some clear narratives. Don't always go into territorial, oppositional politics. Sell the idea to people. And finally, there is hope. Public concern is high, so the public are up for it. And there's a recognition that we don't just have to wait for Westminster anymore to pull the same old levers. Thank you.